And so what I want to present is an idea about how to do it. And the idea of this is all about combustion as the theme, focusing on combustion, because the fact is that 80% of greenhouse gases, they come from combustion. They're burning things to get it. In fact, 96% of total energy use goes through combustion. And those carbon emissions, they are a symptom of our addiction to combustion as the means to drive our economy. The interesting thing is that every single combustion chamber belongs to somebody, and that person gets their value from it. So they've got an interest, and there's an economic value that can be derived, and there are levers that can operate on it. Fossil fuels are not the problem. Fossil fuels only have value because of combustion. They're not worth anything to you until you burn them. A little bit of it you can turn into plastic or lubricants or other things, but basically it's when you burn it that you add the value. And those combustion chambers burning their fossil fuels, they're everywhere. They're in every component of our infrastructure, spread all around the place, and they provide all sorts of valuable services to society. That's what gives the value. And it's the owner of that combustion chamber. They are responsible for the emissions and the air pollution and all the other negative effects. Now, what's so great about combustion? It's why we're wealthy now. So we're in the combustion age. Our entire economy is built on the combustion of fossil fuels. They provide that energy, but they also, hurt people and cause pollution. And whilst they've been incredibly positive and a good thing in many ways for human society, we're now getting to the point where the positives are run by the negatives, and we do have another way. We've got alternatives. We can move towards using non-combustion systems, which I'll go into what they are. And just to illustrate this graph from world data, this is showing world population, how many people live in poverty and how many people are pretty wealthy. And you'll see 200 years ago, most people were desperately poor and just about surviving, and a tiny little elite. Now, most people are actually pretty comfortably off, not many people starving. We're doing pretty well, and there are, even in absolute numbers, fewer very poor people now than there were 200 years ago. And that is because of the combustion age. We have that power to change. But we've got to shift. We've got to move into what I call post-combustion society. And that's where we use our renewable nuclear energy and electrical systems, maybe occasionally some hydrogen ones or other means, but these can give the same services that we value. Why we had that combustion was to get services of heat and power and energy and things, but we can get those without the negative impacts. As I say, there are a few. Basically, it's about going electric. I think 90% of it is going to be dealt with by going electric. Hydrogen will be some part of the issue. Carbon capture can be part of a transition, a bit messy. Very, very important is also regenerative land management and how the way that you get a regenerative system. But I won't go into that at this time because we don't have time for that. So 80% of combustion is embedded in the infrastructure. At the moment, electrical producers, the big power stations and coal fires, that's only about 20%, and even less than that. So it's all these little engines everywhere. So we've got to focus on that. And it's about looking at that demand side. That is where the problem is. It's not on the electrical supply side. If you change the demand and you move that to electrical systems, the supply side will follow. Where there's a market, we can capitalize and make that change. That means vastly, vastly more electrical supply, which is quite unmanageable and a bit of a difficulty to achieve. But the electric systems are much more efficient than combustion systems. So you can deliver those services with less total energy by using electrical systems than by using combustion. An electric car, even if you run it from a coal power station, is still 2 to 3 times more efficient than a combustion car, than a petrol car. So what I'm then building is a framework of how do you do it. I mean, these are nice little observations, but how do you turn that into useful tools that you can actually make things happen with? So just thinking about how you make that that transition. First of all, you've got to maintain resilience. You can't just chuck everything out and, you know, change overnight. You've got to keep some of that combustion as you go. But not all combustion systems are the same. Some are very, very efficient. Some are incredibly inefficient. So you want to be able to sort of understand and measure the relative value of those different systems. You're also going to move to a system of what you might call infrastructure energy. Yeah, so in the past, energy came from consuming stuff. A little bit of infrastructure for your combustion chamber, and then all your effort goes into getting the coal in, piling it out, throwing the ash away. But renewable and nuclear, all of the effort goes into building that infrastructure. Once it's in place, the running costs are negligible, pretty much. But it's a lot of effort to get it into place. Big change in the economics of the process. The limitation is also those materials, and especially a lot of these electrical systems, they need very specific metals and things which can be difficult to get hold of, and you need to have a lot of recycling and things of them. So if you're going to make that change, 3 questions you need to address. Where are we now? What point have we got to now? How far along this process are we? And how far do we have to go? Then what are our priorities in terms of these different combustion processes? How do we spot each individual, the different ones, and decide where to focus our effort on? And when we've decided to focus some effort, how do we make that happen? How do we create incentives and economic measures that are actually going to change how people invest, change how people behave, and what happens? So what I propose is 3 sort of main sort of techniques for doing this. So to measure the progress, something called a non-combustion metric. Some nice sort of jargon here. For prioritization, a combustion accounting metric. Same but different to a carbon accounting metric. And for incentives, combustion transition funds. And I will attempt to explain what these different ones are. So this combustion transition non-combustion metric, it's the measure of how far you're going, and the other one is the quantitative assessment of each process. So for this first one, I'll give you an example of it. And oops, that went the wrong way. There we go. Suddenly I introduced the Oman National Spatial Strategy. So had this idea a couple of years ago, and by a series of random events was asked to, Atkins were doing the Oman National Spatial Strategy. Our chief climate change guy was busy, so they asked me, and I put forward this idea, and they went, "Oh, that seems like a good idea. We'll do that." And now this metric, which I will explain, is government policy for the Sultanate of Oman. That's what they have adopted as their strategy, and this is what they have. You don't need to read it all, but it's a way of sort of expressing this metric. Now I'll try and explain how this works. It's really easy to calculate. So this is Oman's energy use. Simple download from the IEA site. Yeah, and it shows the different sectors of the economy and how much of the total energy consumption is used in each of those sectors. This is then showing where that energy comes from: oil, coal, well, they don't use coal, and natural gas, and electricity. In Oman, it's about 15% electricity. And then of that electricity, where does that go? Into those, that's going back to those classes you saw before. Then you can pop these in a table. I like tables and spreadsheets and all that sort of stuff. Lots of numbers, but what you get is for each sector, you get this non-combustion calculation, the percentage of the energy use which is non-combustion in that sector. And then you can sort of total them up. You get 15%, the same as the amount of electrical energy they're using. It's not a very difficult calculation. So that's how non-combustion they are at the point of demand. And we don't worry, we don't concern ourselves with where that electricity came from, because that's sort of inherent in it. You can then, if you want to actually be, oh, it's the wrong button, it's this one, isn't it? If you actually want to set your target for where you need to get to, you can put some targets in. So we came up with some targets. You want to go from 15% to 60% non-combustion on your demand side. Not going to be easy. And you can then calculate what that means in terms of your energy use. So here you've got your supply side energy use. They use about 32 terawatts, so about 1/10 of the UK. 2% of it is renewable. Demand side, 214 terawatts, 15% is non-combustion. You multiply them together, that's how non-combustion you are, 0.3%. Not really very far along the road towards net zero. That's how dependent they are on fossil fuels, 99.7%. So you can set your target. They'd already decided, and this is all agreed, and they're planning it to go 62% renewable energy by 2040. And they're building they've got lots of potential for solar and wind and all sorts of things. But they don't think about the demand side. Now, if you take this same metric and you do that on the demand side, even this would be a massive, massive effort at the very limit of what people could practically do. And still, at the end of that, in 2040, you'd be at 37% non-combustion. To put this into a bit of context, do the same calculation for the UK, because you all know UK better than you know Oman. So that's the same starter. We, of course, are not on that huge ramp up in energy use. We're gently easing down on our energy use. Our main areas are transport and residential, whereas Oman was mostly industry. This is where our use is, still mostly fossil fuels, bit more electricity, 21% of electricity in the UK. Same table, adds up to 21% at the bottom. You've got your different sectoral areas, and this clicks, yep, there we go. And there's the percentages that you could set as your target to get to your 60%. Now, for the UK, when you combine that up, you find out that at present, our progress is a whopping 9.3%. So we're doing better than Oman, but it still doesn't sound particularly good. We've got a supply side target of 85%. I think I got it from the internet, from various things. I'm sure there are lots of different ones around, but I think that's generally where we're headed. Demand side, if you were to do this same 60% by 2030, again, hugely, hugely ambitious, you'd still only be 51%. So it really gives you an idea, a feel for the scale of the problem and a way of measuring where you are along it. So, talking a little bit more, moving into how you're going to make that transition, get that demand side to move. First of all, efficiency is not the aim in itself. If you insulate your house, if you make your engine more efficient, it helps. It makes it easier, but it doesn't get you where you want to be. You've got to actually get rid of the combustion chamber. Also, a post-combustion society is still high energy. We could be using much more energy than we are at the moment. That isn't the problem. It's not that we've got to use less energy, that we've got to save every watt of electricity. That's not the problem. It depends how as long as you've generated it and you've got it to yourself and you've used it in the right way, non-combustion, doesn't matter. Once you change your house to a heat pump and your car to electric and where it's generated, you're not causing much of a problem. You don't have to go hair shirt on this. Materials will be a limit to growth. As you say, it's infrastructure energy. There's an enormous amount of infrastructure, a lot of metals, a lot of things involved in that. Although, it's not as much as the fossil fuel system is. Also, circular economy. You're going to have to be doing all this circular stuff, being more efficient, moving energy and heat from one place to another, recycling your equipment. That is high energy as well. You need even more energy for that because you're going against the basics of entropy and chemistry and everything. You're always going to have to put in an effort to that. So you need to take this process in stages, have a plan of how to do it, keep combustion there as the backup so that you don't fall over, and focus on all of those embedded combustion systems and get that total lower energy. If you use efficiency, it just makes it a bit easier as well. And I think that electric systems, by their efficiencies, are by far the most effective. For certain applications, hydrogen is kind of necessary, particularly in hard to abate chemical sectors. I mean, there is already a massive hydrogen economy around fertilizers and petrochemicals. Hopefully you won't need as many of those, all based on grey hydrogen. But steel production, some other things can go towards hydrogen to where electricity can't work. But it's horribly inefficient. You can use these transition metrics to then measure how you're doing at a sort of a micro level. So the next combustion transition metric, combustion accounting metric or something, I've probably got to come up with better names for these things. The idea of this thing is, yeah, you're saying center on the combustion chamber, and it's about what goes in, what goes out. I say the great thing about a combustion chamber, it's a closed system. You know, you can count everything. So it's basically your fossil fuel, could be a lump of wood, goes in there. Negative is resource depletion, which you can account for. Bang, you get your greenhouse gas emission, that's easy to account for. You've also got air pollution impacts. One of the nice things about this system, it very closely links air pollution and the other aspects. How you measure it, I'd be inclined to use something like daily lost health and things to get a measure of it, because it's an emission receptor problem. You've got your work done, that's what you did this for, and that gives you your value. So these are the things you can count in this process. Then you can add those up and you can sort of put them together. So you can have your total energy, your kilowatt hours or whatever, or the power, the efficiency with which you're achieving that transition. That's very important when you're comparing one to another. How efficient is your combustion process? How severe are the emissions? If you abate your emissions, you can reduce that, and then you can add some little factors for air pollution and resource impact. But you can come up with a number that describes all of these different things, and you can also see how different improvements and mitigations have benefits. You want to use this to then target at getting rid of combustion. So you've got to target at the guys designing and building and selling the equipment, those who buy that equipment, incentives at the point where they're buying it and using it, the guys who are sort of actually using it, paying for fuel, driving, that sort of thing. And then also you have to consider people buying the products of combustion processes, so steel, concrete, these sort of things, and how they fit. There's another way of accounting for the sort of embedded processes. And you need to come up with some economic instruments that can influence these decisions and change that behavior. So what are these instruments? Combustion transition funds. So these are sort of metrics that you can use. They're sort of microeconomic measures. So they can work in complement to carbon taxes. It's not a replacement for it, but carbon taxes are applying on an open process. And they're always going to be extremely difficult to pin down, because you've got a tragedy of the commons. You're all pumping into one atmosphere and you're all trying to cheat and game the system, and nobody can agree on where the boundaries are of one person's actions and another's, and what went before, what went after. Combustion, closed process. You can count everything and you can pin it onto the person who's responsible. And that's not always the same person that the carbon calculation tells you is responsible. You can then drive that responsibility down as far as you can through the industrial chain, and see how you can actually make a change with this. And so this is trying to set out this sort of mechanism for running your combustion transition fund. So the idea is you want to go from here, your combustion systems, to over here, non-combustion systems, and also regenerative land and water use, which is another element of it, which will be a topic for another day. The idea is, in the crudest form, you would say, you like a carbon tax, you take a levy on your combustion process, but that can be difficult and make you unpopular. It can also be government grants going into this, investors, or you can do offset funding, which I'll come on to. The basic idea is you end up with a combustion transition fund. Time. Okay. And yeah, you use that to accelerate change. So either research and development into the alternatives, improvements in efficiency, or market measures to make the combustion process more effective. And that's basically what you're doing. You're putting that fund together. The members of the fund, the owners of the fund, can withdraw for those purposes, R&D, improvement, or to sort of balance between them. An example of this in a little way is what the International Maritime Organization are doing for sulfur changing. Small levy, research to try and make a change. Another approach can be, if you think of, were you to add carbon capture onto a power station, which will cost you X billion, which is doing nobody any good at all. Instead of doing that, you say that's what it will cost, but you say, well, I'll still emit, because actually that's a really efficient combustion process, but we'll spend all of that money on getting rid of less efficient combustion processes, and you can balance that up. So to wind up, focus on that combustion as a closed process that's valued. Go about it sector by sector. Look at the cars, trucks, trains, planes, boilers, all these different areas, and create schemes specific to each of those sectors and get that industry as involved in ownership of it as possible. We've got metrics to measure where you are, what the efficiency of different things are, and what is the priority of transition. And you can facilitate the process. You do see this huge increase in electrical demand from this, but that can be met. One of the interesting things is that you do get a bit of a counter narrative here, because people tend to focus on those big polluting coal power stations and getting rid of them and thinking, oh, we get rid of them and everything will be all right. To some extent, they are some of the better combustion processes. I mean, the coal one's really pushing it a bit, but a gas power station, a combined cycle gas, the most efficient combustion process on the planet. Frankly, we should be leaving them alone and focusing on keeping them to drive those electric cars, which are going to be 3 times more efficient. So it does need, it gives the numbers behind a different way of focusing on it. It won't always go down as totally popular.
So what's we do need to finish this one. I mean, what you really talking about is much wider systems thinking.
Yes.
To actually drive change, and you've got a theory about the combustion, decombustioning engines. What traction has this got, pardon the pun? Where is in the thinking, and you've shared with us the thinking. What sort of traction has this got now in terms of support?
Not outside of Oman, not a huge amount.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this is not widely presented.
No. Wouldn't an efficient greenhouse gas trading scheme deliver all this, though? Wouldn't it? Surely. Anybody who's emitting any greenhouse gases, there's a price on that that you have to pay to emit. So any combustion process, you have to pay to emit. You then have an efficient greenhouse gas permit system or an equivalent, and that would incentivize people to invest in low carbon emitting combustion processes, and then use decarbonized electricity effectively to run everything else. But there's also the cost of investing. So things like nuclear power, cost of investing in that is enormous. Yeah, the running cost is very low, but the investment, the capital investment, is enormous. And then you've got the problems of the different technologies, that they work properly, all those kind of things as well. But I would have thought a very efficient greenhouse gas trading scheme would deliver this, providing everybody is locked into it, so to speak. So if you have a car, you have to pay a greenhouse gas emission tax.
Yeah.
It's set at the right level, it would incentivize this, but
the thing is,
very difficult.
Yeah, the problem is that there's a big disconnect between that tax and the technology, as it were. That yes, ultimately by sort of circular market forces, it will come round to motivating people to change. I feel that this way, by focusing on the actual technology, which is the problem, and how do you, so rather than just a tax, and it would be supported with carbon tax, and that could be a way of levying it. But the fund is more, the aim is more the fund to focus on a faster transition.
The problem is who pays then? Because this means electricity price is going to go up, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Well, it depends how you generate the power, but it will.
You see, I mean, I'd be more inclined to think that you're focusing much more on the combustion chambers in the infrastructure, that you're taxing them, and you're giving an incentive for them to buy the electricity. The electricity price doesn't necessarily go up too much, although you need to keep enough to invest in more of it.
I think there's a huge amount of food for thought there. Are you willing to share your slides?
Yes, yes, I am.
I mean, obviously, there's an ingestation period for anything like this.
Yeah, it's
Yes,
it is a different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
I mean, the stage I'm at now, I've got the IC are very interested to publish a book on that, which I'm preparing, but I'm a bit slow at. Honestly, I'm a bit busy with the COVID stuff. And I've got research groups at both Oxford and Cambridge who are looking at it, and I do lecture on it there. But what I really want is some wider exposure, but in a controlled environment. I'm not putting this out widely because I don't want it to get sort of just trolled. But I do want more peer review and more challenge on it, because I feel really strongly there's something in this at the core which is good. There's a lot of things that can be done with it, and there's a lot of development that could go into it. And of course, in this context, what I'm thinking is, how does that work in the water sector? How are the ways that you can, how can you change your plan? Or later this evening, if we're looking at, different organisations, how does this change your thinking about how you plan that transition?